Since 1856, when the university was founded, there have been 21 presidents. And of those 21 presidents, Presidents 17, 18, and 19 ate up most of the 20th century. Dr. Moore served for 41 years, from 1897 to 1938. In 1966, Dr. Bentley came and served for 30 years until 1996. In the middle,
Dr. Blackwell.
Dr. Blackwell. Dr. Blackwell, Hoyt Blackwell, served from 1938 to 1966. And in the length of time, in all those 21 presidents, Dr. Moore had 41 years, Dr. Bentley had 30, and Dr. Blackwell had 28. And they pretty much used up the whole century in the time. Dr. Blackwell was born in 1890 in South Carolina, and by 1919, he had found his way to Mars Hill. Now, in that period in between, he had done some other things. He had worked for his family's farm. He had been a rural mail carrier, had spent time in World War I in Camp Meade, Maryland, and had also ended up with the end of that war in France. So he was in France when the war ended. Shortly after the war was over, in the middle of 1919, he came back to the United States, and within a month found his way to Mars Hill. And from 1919 until his death, he pretty much had a lock on this place as home base. In 1923, on Easter Sunday, he was ordained as a minister. He had felt the calling, and that was very much an important part of his life. And the ordination took place in what is now Owen Theater. It was then the Mars Hill Baptist Church. So Owen Theater and the Mars Hill Baptist Church have lots in common along the way. Exactly 10 years later, on Easter Sunday, he met the love of his life in Irwin, Tennessee, Olive Brown. She was a very pretty young woman, and before long a courtship was going on, and by the next year, in September 1934, they were married. And immediately took a honeymoon tour to Europe. In the meantime, I should say that Dr. Blackwell had, by 1928, become a professor here at Mars Hill. He was a teacher of Greek and Bible, as it was called in those days. And he had done a degree in Wake Forest. He studied at the University of North Carolina, Union Seminary, studied at Yale. He was a scholar and continued to study throughout his whole life. So when he went to Europe, and there's a wonderful photograph of him on the Areopagus where that wonderful sermon was preached that Mars Hill gets its name from. He was probably in his element. That was probably the zenith of things for him in his lifetime, to be actually on the place that Mars Hill gets its name from. Anyway, he was invited back by Dr. Moore in 1935. The college needed somebody, and the term was enlargement. Somebody to help with the enlargement of the campus, and that meant not only with the physical enlargement of the campus, but also a kind of what we now call development. Somebody to go out and raise money, because the college was in need of buildings. And indeed, Dr. Blackwell became that person. And the first money he was empowered to raise ended up being Moore Dormitory, which had its formal opening in 1938. In 1938, in June, Dr. Moore announced, and he did it very cleverly, he announced it in the newspaper so that the trustees couldn't make him reconsider. He announced his retirement, and the board was pressed very quickly into finding a replacement. At that meeting, all 17 of those board members were asked to write on a piece of paper the man they thought should take the job as the next president. And all 17 wrote down Hoyt Blackwell. And that very day, after consulting with Mrs. Blackwell, he became the president, the 18th president of Mars Hill College. Dr. Blackwell and Mrs. Blackwell had 3 children. Hannah is the oldest, then Albert, and then Eric. And guess what? we have Eric and his wife Janis right here from Lubbock, Texas. Before we talk though, I want to introduce Richard Dillingham. And Richard is a consultant, historical consultant, and advisor to the college in all things historical. And he knows more about the college than anybody here. And Dr. John Hough, who is, everybody knows in town, John is a legend. How many times when you turn 80 does the whole church congregation sing happy birthday to you on Sunday morning? Not only that, they made him come up and stand in front, down by the front, so he had to endure the whole song. That was quite.
When was this?
This one,
When was this?
2 years ago.
Yeah. So that was a great day, John. It showed everybody's love and affection for you. And they know that when people talk about Mars Hill, John Hough is right there at the top of what Mars Hill is and what he represents.
I hadn't finished the experience since you told me about Mr.
Tell me.
Blackwell.
Tell me.
Because, you know, I left and then came back. And Miss Blackwell came to me the first Sunday that we were coming out of church. And she said, you told me you'd come back.
And there you were. That story is interesting too because of Miss Nelson's involvement in getting you back. I should say that John is being very modest. He was, when he came here in 1954, John, is that correct, as a freshman?
62.
No, as a freshman. He
Oh,
was
as a freshman, 53, 54.
53, 54, I thought I remembered that. He was president of the freshman class. And there's a wonderful picture of him in the book that is the coffee table book through the long years as a freshman in front of Hoyt Theater. It's nice to see that you haven't changed much, John, in all that length of time. One of the wonderful things about, for me, having come in, all of you all spent your lives here, and you got to know Dr. Blackwell very well. I got to know him slightly, but not in any way the way that you all did. With Eric and Janis, I am so curious to know, from the family's viewpoint, people have talked about your dad and your dad-in-law, and that, you know, the words are always gracious and charming, and he was the epitome of all that was the Southern charm, the gentleman, and all those kinds of things. Tell me what you know about your dad that we don't know. How was he at home, for example? Tell me what that was like.
Well, we had talked earlier about the fact that Dad was born in 1890. I was born in 1945. So when we do family history, it's like we're missing a generation, you know. He was just the most loving, gentle person. The Hoyt that you saw on campus was the Hoyt that we saw at home. I mean, he didn't have two personas.
Did he ever discuss college issues at home, over dinner, for example?
If he did, as a child, I paid no attention to him. I was deciding what I could ask him for next, like a ham radio outfit.
Oh, okay. Was he indulgent?
Oh my goodness, yeah, it's embarrassing. He and my mother both lived so simply and gave us everything we ever wanted or asked for or needed, certainly what we needed and most of the other stuff. And I have to say, just talking about remembering that, and Janis and I, of course, grew up together, we should point out that her parents were married in my living room by my father at Edgewood, the house.
And
that's how far back we go.
Yeah.
So,
and when my mother was in school here, her best friend was a Hilton. It was Dr. Blackwell's niece. So to get off campus, they would go see the Blackwells and baby Hannah. Because he was president then, and he was, they were in Edgewood. So
There was no
well,
way was
actually, I think at the time they were still in the
were
little
they still
house.
in the little house? Okay.
Yeah, where our house is now.
Yeah.
Up there, they had a little farmhouse. Dad bought that and about an acre of land early on, long before they were married. And so when they were first married, that's where they lived. And he didn't, I guess, move into Edgewood. I'm assuming at the time
In 38,
he
I
became
think.
president. Yeah.
That's right. I think that's right. And of course, Edgewood, we should explain, is the name of the president's home on campus, or the former president's home, the former home, I guess we should say, since it's not there anymore. Of course, when you,
Because I think it was 38 when she was in school here.
okay.
That was one
Well,
of the
then
years.
it could have been, if that's the case. It could have been.
That's right. But he had the property where the current Blackwell home is. Before it was another house on that property where he lived. Is that correct?
Exactly. It was down right at the corner now where there's just a tree.
Yes.
And when he built his retirement home, he moved it up the hill, maybe so he could keep an eye on the campus. I don't know.
Okay. You mentioned the generation skip. Did you notice along the way, were you as children aware of the fact that your parents were somewhat older probably than your peer group? Were you ever aware?
Well, I was in that I'd be at summer camp and they'd come up and get me and say, your grandparents are here to visit you, for example. And it was my parents.
It was your parents, but that wasn't a big deal. I mean, they
Oh, no. No.
I gotta ask one question. How did you get Daddy Blackwell?
Yes.
Well, actually, that's in the original From These Stones, I believe, or maybe it's in Ken Sanford's
From these stones.
where he was acting. Something happened apparently with the house mother in, maybe it was Melrose dorm, one of the dorms.
One of the dorms.
And so he became the sort of house father. And the story is that somebody taped something on his door that said, Hoyt, his daddy.
Well, and see, they called all of the house mothers mother, whatever,
That's right,
the
yes.
last name, so he
Yes.
was Daddy Blackwell.
That's right. And so it became a paternalistic kind of place in a way because of that, wasn't it?
I think in the best, gentle sort of way.
It
Yes.
is,
Yeah,
yeah.
a loving father.
Right. And
Well, he was very friendly, he waved to everybody. And then we had a priest in Lubbock who went to Morrisville College, Father Allen, and he and John Claypool were best buddies. They both were here at Morrisville together. And they both went into the ministry. But Father Allen said that his first day on campus, that he was walking on campus and Daddy Blackwell called him by name and said, hello, we're so glad you're here. And what he found out later was that Dr. Blackwell would take the applications, which always had a picture on them, and he would memorize the face and the name so that he could call everybody, all the new students, by name.
that must have been terribly exciting for a young person to know that the president, or you were.
Yeah, yeah.
That's quite
How
amazing.
did he drive? I never could figure out how he drove.
Well, of course,
He's waving with both
people
hands.
think the self-driving car is a new concept. But it was rumored that since Dad waved with both hands, and even back in 1950, I have a picture that I'm sure was posed, made of Dad in front of, I'm not sure whether it was still the church or whether it was just in transition, but it was about 1956,
Yeah, well,
with his 56 Buick and his overcoat and waving.
Anyway,
Yeah.
that probably captures him of every memory.
Yeah, I'm glad
memory. Yeah.
somebody did that.
Richard told me not long ago about, you mentioned the marriage in the house. Richard told me about your parents. Tell us about your.
Yes. My family came from the Piney Mountain Baptist Church where he was pastor.
Yes, and Kendall also.
Dr. Kendall was
Kendall.
pastor there also, our
McLeod
next door
followed
neighbor.
Dr. Blackwell, and then Kendall followed Professor McLeod. So
Right.
I grew up under those three professors.
Oh, really? I didn't know McLeod did that.
And my father told me that when Dr. and Mrs. Blackwell were married in Irwin, Tennessee, the whole church went in a farm truck.
Really? Oh, my
And they got
goodness.
there, and my father said he had never seen so many presents in all of his life. Of course, if there's more than 2 or 3, my father had not seen presents.
I had never heard of that.
Yeah, he married my parents, so that,
Where was
That's
that
been-
marriage? Where was that marriage?
it was in the First Baptist Church of Irwin, Tennessee.
No, I know that one. Your parents, where were they married?
I can't remember, but
I thought you had told me it was at your house,
it probably was.
that he came into your house. So he married a lot of people.
Yes, he did.
Golly.
I have to tell you a funny story related to marriages that he did. Dad was always very gentle, and if somebody made a mistake, he would generally ignore it or correct it himself and not complain about it. He dictated once, he had been invited to the coast of North Carolina to help with the wedding, and he said, dictating, he said, I am so grateful that you've asked me to officiate at your wedding. And the letter came back typed, I'm so glad you invited me to a fish eat at your wedding. It was on the coast.
That's so funny. That is so. That makes very good sense.
Yes.
Oh, that's funny.
The loaves and fishes.
When did you become aware that your father was somebody special in this place? Was there a moment that clicked with you that not everybody's father was like your father?
Well, You know, it's a hard question. Growing up, your home is your home. I mean, you don't have anything to compare it to. So I was probably at least 10 or 12 before I noticed that Dad got a lot of attention at
Right.
special events like commencement.
But he was up there.
And he was always very inclusive of us. If we were around, you know, he would introduce us to everyone, and so we never felt shunned, you know, pushed aside at all by that. And then as I got older, I realized, and I guess really culminating with his retirement in that, I believe it was 1966 commencement, when there was the transition to Dr. Bentley.
Yeah.
So many people had so many kind things to say about Dad and his tenure here. And a few snarky things I heard behind the back about, it was all buildings and no faculty development. I mean, you know, I think that was a concern, but it was a thread.
Well, every president goes through that sort of arc, and you know, you can't do anything right, but in the eyes of some folks. But your father, I went back and looked, speaking about the buildings, I went back and looked. I was curious to know how many buildings were built when he was here. I wrote them down. The Wall Science Building in 1940, Straub Dormitory in 1941, Huffman Dorm in 1947, Court Bridges Dining Hall in 48, a Miners Dorm in 55, Memorial Library, which is now Nash Hall, in 55, the Robert Lee Moratorium, Fine Arts Building in 60, Fox Dorm in 63, and the Harold Pool and Chambers Gym in 66. That is an amazing, amazing.
Well, I think I have it right that he left the college debt-free.
You would know that, which is true. And how many people can say that?
Yeah,
That was
and that was criticized. Some people said there should have been debt. You know, we could have done more if we leveraged.
He used the Baptist money to cover the cost of the buildings most time. I mean, that was the, that all that money basically went into the buildings.
Wasn't large amounts, but it was
No,
good.
no.
Talk to me a little bit about Miss Nelson's role. I know, for example, Dr. Blackwell had, before he became president, had served in that role of having to go out and raise money. So he knew that that was essential for the college to stay alive. And he knew when he became president that that was going to be a major role as a president. Tell me about Miss Snelson. I know that she had been also an associate to Dr. Moore, so she moved right along.
Yes.
Well, I'm wondering if, because she went to college here, when
Yes.
my mother went to college
Okay.
here. And I'm wondering, see, my mother went to UNCG and got her 4-year degree, but Miss Nelson may have started working very soon after she did her associate degree here. I'm wondering, do you know that?
Do you know, Richard, whether she came?
I don't know that, but I think she did.
I did too.
Yeah, so she just stayed here and kept going.
I'm thinking must.
That makes very good sense. Were you aware of her importance in the hierarchy of the way the campus
I
was?
was to an extent. I mean, certainly Dad depended on her, you know, for a lot of things. As a little kid, what impressed me was her typing speed. I couldn't imagine how anybody could, you know, I'd go in and I was 7 or 8 years old and she'd be over there doing this and paper would be flying out. But the other way we knew her, and you all probably know this, is she was also the wedding planner.
I was going to say, yes.
Including my sister.
You just knew she could, you know, be in control and
Took
get
great
people
pride
to
in
do
that.
things
Yes, and was
and
quite good at it.
very good at, you know.
Was it the assumption that she would just do everybody's wedding, or did you have to ask her?
Well, we had to
think it was-
ask her, but
Did we?
we did.
I assumed, you must have asked.
Or my mom, maybe, I don't know, but.
Well, thank
no,
you.
she was the wedding planner for our wedding.
Yes, well, that makes sense.
The coordinator.
Coordinator. Well, she did this.
I'm tempted to tell an interesting story
Okay.
about Miss Francis. At one time, we invited the state archivist to meet with us in college archives, and Dr. Bentley was there, and Miss Francis and others were there. And they were talking about various things, and it dawned on me that Miss Francis had served under 3 presidents. And I said, we have decided that once Miss Francis passes, this is in front of her, once Miss Francis passes, we're going to put her remains here in the archives, and we're going to pull it out and say, now this is Francis Nelson, who served 3 college presidents and works at
I hope you actually followed up on this.
No. She laughed till she cried. Oh, yes.
Well, and of course, we knew Miss Nelson, Miss Bingham as a, you know, they were always together and seemed to look after each other very well.
And very
And
active and.
I have an embarrassing story to tell. When Miss Bingham was ill late in her life, we went over to visit their home over on the ridge over there. And we were sitting and talking, and I noticed Miss Bingham was fiddling with her oxygen. It turns out my foot was on her oxygen line. Well, I said, when we left, I said, I hope she lives at least another week because I'm going to feel really bad.
Well, Miss Nelson's the one that said, you know, you have to put
Your foot is on the line.
Thank goodness.
Well, you know that Miss Nelson ultimately was the reason why this series of interviews got going. I had spoken to Dr. Bentley and to how many people did I go to? Dr. Lennon for sure. I said, we must get a video interview of Frances. I said, you know, she knows everything. She knows where all the bodies are buried. We need to have that on tape. And nobody sort of thought that was important, and nobody did anything about it. And when she died in 2002, I thought, okay, that was a huge mistake for us not to have gotten her to talk, because she knew wonderful things. She also, later on, when SART became an important function in the summers, she would run the receptions. I remember when I had a play, she was so excited. She came to me, see, Robert, this was a play set in Charleston during the Civil War. And she says, I have done my research. We're going to have Benny wafers at your reception. I didn't know what Benny wafers were.
I don't know.
Well, it's a little cracker with seeds on top, and it's a Charleston delicacy, you see. So she'd done her homework. And indeed, we had them at that party, I remember very well, but I didn't ever tell her I didn't know what they were. Tell me, you were talking about the college itself. Was there ever any question that the children would come here? I know that your family assumed that you would come here. Was there a question that you all would come here immediately?
We were not pushed into doing
Yeah, I
it,
think.
but it was convenient. I knew I could eat my mother's cooking. Lodging
Well, I
would be
think we
provided
just
cheap.
grew up
Yeah.
thinking that we would go to school here. And at that time, it was a 2-year school. It was very well thought of. You could get an excellent education here and then go wherever you wanted to go.
Right.
I noticed Dr. Jolly referred to that in his interview, the fact that at that time,
It
that other
was
places
top
like
ranked.
UNC or whatever would be very happy to have the Mars Hill students because they knew they would be well.
And you left after you were here for 2 years, is that right?
Yeah, I was here for 2 years and then finished up elsewhere.
It was, Mars Hill was one of the first schools to be accredited as a junior college by Southern Association.
Yes. And I read somewhere in one of them.
It was ranked top 10, top 5, something like that.
Well, and the faculty members, of course, that since I did go here, I had a chance to have some. I mean, we're really top notch. I mean, Ella Pierce and Mary Ehrig and Bill Pegg and Emmett Sands.
Didn't we go to summer school so we would have Ella Pierce before she retired?
Well, I went to summer school and had Vernon Booger Wood.
Yes.
Well, we
for
did that
chemistry.
too, We went to
Summer
summer
school,
school
so
down
you
here
could-
before he retired.
Who used to, Booger Wood
Yes.
used to love to demonstrate the difference between walking and running. Do you know this?
No.
You know, he was a big guy.
He was a
And
tennis
he would-
coach,
And he
wasn't
was on a podium.
I don't know, see, that was
His
a
desk was, and his chair was up on a wooden podium.
But to illustrate, he would get up from behind his desk and get out where everyone could
Or
see.
his chair.
And the point was that if both of your feet are off the ground for a moment, you're running. But if one follows the other, you're walking. And he would say, now watch my center of gravity.
But you could see the little platform.
That's a very, because I never knew him until he was sort of really old, and I can't imagine his doing that.
Well, he
Were
was
you
really
aware?
old when he did it, yeah.
Were you aware he critiqued the pastors at the church?
No, he could walk.
He critiqued the
Oh, he
pastors.
creeped out.
Oh, every Sunday he critiqued the pastor and told him afterwards what he said wrong and what he.
Well, that doesn't surprise me. It seems in character.
Well, tell him about one of the questions he asked you in
Oh,
class.
yeah. He knew, of course, who I was and that I'd grown up here and everything else. And he says, Mr. Blackwell, what kind of a tree is it growing in? And it's this building.
Yeah, it's right there, that tree right there that had the rock
And I
around
had
it.
no idea. And he says, that's the trouble with young people these days. They don't pay attention to anything, he said. And I was like, I went out and learned every freaking tree on campus. He said, what's the name?
Yeah, it's a sycamore
Yes.
tree, yes, it is.
You would have passed. See, I would have passed. Yes, that's right. And the other thing, he says, what's the name of the creek that passes through the edge of the football field? I didn't know. Spoon Creek, I believe is the correct answer. And he could trace it all the way to the Mississippi River. Yeah, so you never knew.
You never knew. I know your parents both were very much interested in the arts. In fact, you had a stage debut very early, not only as a May Court.
Yes, I was the crown bearer when Bob Melvin was the king.
In the May Day. And then I read somewhere in 1951 you were in the cast of Chico by the Dozen.
I was, and I missed my cue and was mortified.
But you couldn't have been very old then.
Oh, I was the littlest one,
Yes, I know.
the children are stair-stepped, and I was the last one.
Right.
And Lowell Sodeman was the father, who was the minister at the
Yes.
church. And what he did, he blew a whistle, and when he blew the whistle, we were all supposed to come on stage. And I was doing something else and didn't hear it. So he blew it again. And then he came out to the edge of the stage and he blew it again. And then I finally came in. The audience loved it, they thought it was stage.
Yeah.
He kept it the next night.
I'm not sure I was invited back.
Did you ever consider, I know you were a child when all that happened, did you ever consider, I know you are a doctor now, but did you ever consider going into any aspect of the arts? I know your brother's a musician.
Yes.
Well, he is a musician also.
Tell me, I don't know this.
Well, again, going back to growing up in Mars Hill, what parents did with their children, if we didn't have to farm, and we didn't, was they put us in music lessons. So I had Miss Martha
Miss
Biggers.
Martha was excellent.
And there was no better teacher for young people on earth. And then Albert sort of ran with that. He had Miss Martha, and then he had several other people. Sinclair, I believe, was one of them, who really brought him up to another level. I branched off and found the organ interesting, and actually got to study with Donna Nagy Robertson.
Did you?
Which was and it was not too long after she'd come here, I guess, which was just a wonderful experience.
And
She had
she's
trained, I
still a
believe, in East.
delight, and
Yes.
we keep in touch with her.
And it was her mentor there, I believe David Craighead, who came and did the dedicatory recital when we got the Aeolian Skinner organ put in.
You were lucky to have her as a
Oh,
musician.
goodness.
You'll be pleased to know that she's leading her papers to Mars Hill University, and her manuscripts for her
I'm so
composition.
glad. When we were
Oh,
here
that's
back
wonderful.
in February, the timing just happened to be right. She was doing a piano lecture demonstration at, what's the name of the?
Gibbons.
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 And we went with Joel and Ginger Reed.
And they were classmates of yours.
Yes,
Yes.
Joel and Ginger were both classmates of
And of
ours.
course, Joel had his twin brother.
I know.
Yes, Carol was
Carol.
too, and they were both in student government when I was Secretary of Student Government, and I was in the Senate.
I want
Also.
you to know, I found this, and I had the best time looking at the 1968 annual.
Mhm.
Janice Elam was in the court in the Senate. I don't just scanned. I didn't go. She was a member of Sigma Alpha Chi. She was a majorette. It's a wonderful picture of you in the majorette costume. The finalist for Miss Laurel.
Uh-huh.
Who's Who. Well, you turn a page and there she is. You must have had a wonderful time during that period.
Well, I did, and that's one reason I did not transfer. Because number one, you had to take time to fill out the applications and do all that, and I was having a wonderful time
Yeah.
here, and getting a good education, I thought, and so I just decided to stay.
And your class was a terrific class. I got to know many of those folks in a peculiar way. I first came here just as you were graduating. I directed a play that summer for Jim Thomas's Summer Theater Workshop. And I met people like Candy Cole and Jay Flippin and all those incredible people
Yes,
who were
yes.
classmates of yours.
Yes.
And of course, President Dan Lunchard was a student here a year behind
Yes,
you.
but he was very quiet. He was in the student government because when he became president, they said, well, he was in the government, student government. So I had to go back and look in the annual to see, he was a year behind us.
Did you do any
actually.
plays during that period?
I did, but not a lot because
I
was in the
she
band.
The Mouse That Roared.
the mouse that roared,
okay.
right?
I remember that.
And Mr. T tried to get me to audition for the play that Perry White
Yeah, Perry White.
was in. It was
Yeah.
a two-man show, and it was Perry White, and I can't remember the lady's name that was in it with him.
I don't know that I know.
But I just figured, that was a lot. you'd had a lot to memorize. And I was already in the band, I was in the Asheville Symphony, and I was in student government, and I was in a lot of things, and I just thought that might spread me too thin, so I didn't.
And this is where you and John linked, because you were in one of his classes, at least one of his classes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
And he was her
I was
advisor, too.
I was a math major for 2 years, and then there were type of problems that I really didn't enjoy, and nobody could tell me how you would use those and what exactly. And in retrospect, that was a mistake for me, probably, to change my major. But I decided to change my major. My sister was in education, and she said, and I was babysitter I was Mother Goose on Powell Ridge, so, you know, all the kids. And so I thought, okay, I'll change and I'll be an elementary education major. And I already had all of my minor, and I was gonna do all of my electives the senior year, but because I changed my major, I didn't get to do all the art I wanted. The only art class I took was the elementary art class that you have to take, but I thoroughly enjoyed that.
Did you say, were you going to say something?
No.
Oh, did you go on after you left here to do a further training in education?
Yes, I did. I've taken classes at UNCG. I've taken classes at Harvard.
My goodness.
And I've taken classes at Wake Forest. One of the things I took at Wake Forest was part of the Renolda House program.
They have a
And
gorgeous place.
it was wonderful, and I don't know if they still do it, but Nick Bragg was in charge of that at Wake Forest.
Do you know that program?
I do know that program.
You know, where they study
Summers.
certain artists, and then they actually make a field trip.
That's right.
In her
We
case,
went
it was
up to
to
Hudson.
upstate New York.
That's right. I had a former student who was there one summer. Loved it. That was
And my sister had done it, so I knew about it. And what did Nick Bragg say?
Nick Bragg, the director, thought they were both fine-looking young women and said, "Why did P.R. Elam ever quit having daughters?" He said.
We haven't talked about your parents, Janice. I got to know them when I first came here. Didn't get to know them well. I remember vividly in church, your mom was always such a gracious, always so gracious, and was so genteel, and it made me feel at home right off the bat, and I was so pleased about that. And I always got to talk to your dad in the post office. It was the only place they ever saw him. Somebody told me when you come to a small town, don't plan to go to the post office for just 5 minutes. You better plan 20 at least, because you'll see somebody that you haven't seen for a while. And we always visited in the post office. He was a charmer. You all knew him very well, and of course I didn't. Are there stories that you all know?
Well, my interest in the interview would be probably as it relates to the larger community, not just the college. And parents would be part of that.
Okay.
For instance, when Dr. Underwood interviewed Professor McLeod, who wrote our history and all, he explained to her the difference between the Blackwell administration and the Moore administration is that Moore administered by principle and Blackwell administered by policy. One of those policies, I think, has blessed this community forever, and the policy was that all new faculty and all, the college would help them buy homes within the community. And with the coming of that, that population so enriched the community that it blessed the high school, and it became one of the top high schools in the state of North Carolina, and the church, and also the town. So what I'm interested in are those families that come from that larger community that's a result of his policy. But when Blackwell came, the institution ceased doing that, but it's forever changed. And today, if you look at North Carolina, the majority of the North Carolinians living in this state were not native born. The majority. If you look at Madison County today, that's probably true here today. So a lot has changed since Dr. Blackwell was our president. But I would like to hear the two of you talk briefly about your families. For instance, the Blackwell and the Browns.
Well,
And your two families, and the Robertses and all. And I would like for you to also connect them.
Let's start there, because her roots in this county
Yes, I know.
are incredibly deep.
Yes, I know, the Roberts and the Elams.
Right.
And once you do that, I want you to comment on your grandparents of the Browns in Tennessee and the Blackwells in South Carolina. That would help us greatly.
You first.
Okay. Well, my dad grew up in Kings Mountain, North Carolina. He went to NC State. and he got an animal husbandry degree, and he was assistant county agent, and that's what brought him to Madison County. So
To Marshall.
to Marshall specifically. And my mother was in college. She came home and she just happened to go to the Baptist church because her mother was Methodist.
Yes.
And there was a Methodist church there at Marshall. But there was this new guy in the choir. When you go to a small town,
Yes.
new people stick out.
Yeah.
So she wanted, and so it turns out somebody introduced him to her and they started dating. And when she graduated in May, they got married in September. So that's what, so he stayed in the county. But the Robertses, she was a Roberts, and the Robertses were land granted, their land, and it was considerable amount of land. In the 1700s, I guess, from the king. And I don't know specifics, I've been told that, but I don't have it down straight. But
Your ancestor, Stephen Roberts, managed the Hot Springs Hotel.
that's
That's her
my
grandfather.
Grandfather, yes.
That's my grandfather. And he also was part owner in a hotel on Lake Michigan. And he started developing adult asthma. And the doctor said, you need to go back down to the mountains of North Carolina. And his brother was a doctor. And of course, the doctors had the pharmacy. So he came down and he ran the pharmacy
In Marshall.
in Marshall. And my grandmother, who was an English, and her father's building is still standing. If you go up to Bald Mountain, he owned a lot of that land. All the brothers owned a lot of land. And she was a teacher on the island, and she roomed in that boarding house, and she had to pass by the pharmacy. And he saw her, and evidently she was very beautiful, and he said, I'm going to marry that woman.
When PR came to Marshall, he is solely responsible of establishing the French Broad Electric Membership Corporation single-handedly and starting that.
Really?
And so,
Yeah, he was on that board.
So we have
for a
electricity
while.
in
I think he
Madison
was
County.
eventually also on the board of the Tennessee Valley Authority.
He was on the
TVA.
board of the TVA.
Prominent families in Marseille.
How did you all meet?
You tell
Well,
them that.
Well, there's
He
a funny
likes that
family story.
story.
I told you her parents were married in my living room.
Yeah.
Right? Well, when I had just been born at St. Joseph Hospital in Asheville, and her dad happened to be in St. Joseph's having had his appendix out. And so Mrs. Elam, very pregnant with Janice, came to visit my mother and see how she was doing. And my brother,
the baby.
who is, of course, in the theology realm, says, and the babe leapt for joy in her womb. That's how far back we went. Now, on the other hand, we started dating our junior year in high school, junior senior banquet, and dated for 11 years, not rushing into anything.
Yeah.
But I tell everybody, I knew every girlfriend he had though.
I did
Because I
too.
grew
Oh,
up
yeah.
with him. Yeah, right.
Talk about your Blackwells and your Browns
Yeah.
from South Carolina and Tennessee.
Well, Dad's
Yes.
family were, as McLeod points out in the opening From These Stones, upstate South Carolina cotton farmers, basically. They were very successful, did well with that. His brothers were in that business and were entrepreneurial. The Blackwell Brothers Cotton Company out of Lancaster, South Carolina, or Kershaw. And then one of the brothers sold mules to the Army during the Second World War and made a lot of money. But at any rate, that family was totally solid. But Dad was, as far as I know, the only one that ever felt this call to the ministry and further education. And I don't understand how it happened. I mean,
Tell about your grandfather, what he said to your dad when you said.
well, I think I know what you're saying is Dad had been a rural mail carrier, as you pointed out, I think for 10 years. That was a good job. His oldest brother, Claude, had been a mail carrier, and I'm assuming sort of said, Hoyt, here's, you had to take the civil service exam even back then, but it was pretty predictable work and paid pretty well. Well, kind of like her dad being the county assistant farm agent, he knew everyone in every little cove because of that responsibility. Well, my dad, being the mail carrier, knew everybody in every little nook and cranny of his county. And I'll digress a minute to come around to a story toward the end of his life. He loved that country and had bought up farmland when it was, you could buy it for $1 or $2 an acre. Ruined farmland, it was called, because it was farmed out. he found that there was a program that would let him plant pine trees at essentially no cost and pay you then not to do anything with the land while the pine trees grew. Well, when he was in his 80s, he went down and they were cutting some timber, and he went into the woods to talk to somebody, and one of the trees fell and hit him right in the shoulder, and it broke his collarbone and cracked his clavicle. So he ended up in the hospital in Lancaster, South Carolina, and his surgeon, his orthopedic guy, was actually the twin brother of one of the astronauts. Duke was the last name. One Duke became an astronaut, the other became a surgeon. But Dad, after a rough stretch of several weeks in that hospital, came out and said to someone without a trace of irony, "You know, that was a great experience." And the reason he said that was all the people looking after him, all the orderlies and nurses, were the grandchildren of the people he had known carrying the mail. So he'd see their name and he'd say, "Now let's see, are you related to the Mr. Blackman that we
What a
have?"
wonderful story. So we were back
that
in
was
time.
just his attitude. He was so positive about things. And we were talking briefly on the phone this morning. We just mentioned that I don't know much about Dad because Dad didn't like talking about Dad. And see,
But that
Robert was saying it was,
Blackwell pine forest grew to maturity by the
Yes.
time he retired and was worth a fortune.
well, and he left it to us
I
and
know.
died with
But-
owning one suit, his Bible, and a
Really?
pair of glasses. I mean, that's the
God
kind of
love
guy
him.
he was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That was
What about the
But
Browns?
it helped them get their education.
That's great.
Trees did.
Yeah. But anyway, it's that positive attitude. Again, like I said at the beginning, that was just the way he was. It wasn't an act in front of the trustees. It was his
And
Behind
image.
somebody
every
said
great
that
man
was-
is a good woman.
Well, there's
Talk
certainly-
about those Browns.
Yes.
Oh,
Well, the Browns, as you mentioned, he met, Dad was a supply minister. I guess that's a good Baptist term, where some of the regular ministers away and they bring in someone to pinch hit. And Dad did that a lot, including some more or less full-time ministers like yours. So he had been asked to be the supply minister at Irwin's First Baptist Church, which was built on land given by the Brown family right across the Brown home. And the Brown family, being the ones that lived right next to the church, traditionally always had the minister lunch
A
after.
businessman
Yeah.
in Irwin.
mhm.
Yes, he was. His story's an interesting one too. But anyway, so Dad just in the course of being fed lunch after his sermon, met my mom to be, and she wrote a funny thing about it called How It All Began. I don't know if you guys have seen
And
the
it was
copy of that.
their 50th wedding
But-
anniversary.
Yeah, she talks about the fact that, yes, then they did actually go out for a ride in the car with her two nieces and her mother.
In the back seat.
All of them. Right. But then, yeah, when they
Yeah, he
eventually
had
got married,
noticed-
she had been for many years, like his 10 years carrying the rural mail, she was about 10 years being the business office manager for the A.R. Brown General Store. And her father had been orphaned at the end of the Civil War, when his father, William Laban Brown from Knox County, Tennessee, died on the Sultana, the steamship that
He
exploded.
had been in a prison camp.
Yeah, he fought for the North.
He fought for the North, and he'd been a scout, I think, but he had been captured, and he was in a prison camp, and he survived all of that. And then he had to be mustered out in Ohio or somewhere north, and he was on his way, and they had overloaded that ship.
Yeah, the History Channel has a wonderful, well, it's not, the story's not wonderful, but it's well told about the Sultana and the fact that there were more people died in that accident than on the Titanic. There were people stacked, they had to stand, there wasn't room to sit down.
Yeah.
And it was
And
because it was graft. There was 50 cents a head for
Yeah.
everybody they would
Yeah.
take, and they left 2 or 3 boats empty and put everybody on this one.
But because this guy wanted the money.
And the boiler exploded about a couple of miles north of Memphis. And of course, back then, very few people knew how to swim. It was April, it was flood stage of the river, bodies washed up all the way down, for 80 miles. So his wife, his widow, was left with these children. And she went to Washington, D.C. and put them in an orphanage, basically. It was a soldiers and sailors' children's home.
But it was Johnson's home, right?
No, it was,
wasn't-
who was the president of the Confederacy?
Jefferson
Davis.
Jefferson Davis. It was Jefferson
Davis's
Davis's
house.
confiscated house,
Ah.
just like Arlington was confiscated after the war. And so that's where he got his early education.
It was
And-
right next to that huge office building that's made out of granite, that's still standing.
He then, this A.R. Brown, my mother's father, became a traveling salesman up in the western North Carolina, Tennessee mountains, and working for a company out of Knoxville, Tennessee. But this was the horse and wagon. And one of his stops was in Little Plumtree, North Carolina, where C.W. Burleson, Charles Wesley Burleson, had a general store. And C.W. Burleson's daughter, Tubby, which is actually her name, she was named for an aunt who was nicknamed Tubby. But her actual name is Tubby. And this is the same thing. My granddad saw her when she was 12 years old, said, "That's the girl I'm going to marry," and waited until she was of marriageable age.
And that was it.
And she was beautiful. She had blue eyes, and often the Englishes. She was kin to the Englishes.
Well, the quick aside, the Burleson
And dark
family,
hair.
when we got to Texas, I didn't know anything about Texas history until my kids started taking, Texas history in school. And the guy, one of the guys who was head of a regiment at the Battle of San Jacinto, where we got our independence from Mexico, was a Burleson. And I got interested in that. And it turns out he's my first cousin, 6 generations back. He came from Buncombe County, North Carolina. Yeah, of course
The reason I asked you about your family is because I wanted to give you something. One of the motivating factors in my life has been the hands of heritage. When I look at my hands, I see the influence of my parents and my grandparents. And you guys should do the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
And it is a miracle what we come from and what they did before us. So in the Blackwell administration, and I know both of your families coming from 4 or 5 different areas, and you look at all of those scores of individuals who got us here, we are recipients of that blessing. And the 2 of you are examples of that in the Mars Hill community. In your church, those families that blessed you, from those 3 pastors, from Sullivan to Seymour to Price and to Davis, all of them, great influences. And if you look at those same individuals in your high school together, then once you get to Mars Hill, it's my opinion that that ethos of Mars Hill came out of the policy of Dr. Blackwell and that administration. So when you look at your hands, remember that we come from great people.
We do, yes, we do, and we're very grateful.
Yes, sometimes we wonder if we're carrying the banner as well as we
I would
should.
like to hear you talk about some of those Mars Hill families. You've already done some
Well,
of that.
the land that my dad bought to build his house on North Main Street, which now the Arceys, and they're living in the community. He's had a chance to be sent other places, and they want to stay here. It was Dr.
Oscar Sanders.
No, it was
Shelby Vance.
Shelby Vance's, Dr.
really?
Shelby Vance's. It was 2 lots, and he had bought those lots. And we think that probably he had decided to go back to Africa to be a missionary, and he would not build on those lots. So Dad, he sold them to Dad. And
It had been the public school grounds at one point.
the
and their
playground.
Exactly.
backyard was packed from years of playground activity.
And it was
Before you
clay.
it was hard to grow anything.
The Mars Hill
Yeah.
School was right there beside the property.
Yeah, and my dad, we tried to grow things, and you irrigated the land, to get the grass to grow. And so he finally, being a farm person, he finally grew clover. And Mr. Tilson, who did the grounds at Mars Hill, thought, where are you ever planting that clover in your yard? He thought it was terrible, but it was green.
Well, probably not a bad place to segue into the Vance family, which of course is another remarkable, distantly related to the Zebulon Vance, who was the Civil War governor, and David Vance, his dad, who owned much of the land. And my understanding is that Zebulon Vance, the governor, actually had to do with giving the land on which the town of Marshall developed. It was then called Lapland, I think.
Lapland,
So Bob Vance, Shelby's son, and I were best friends growing up until Bob
From
moved
babyhood.
away. Yeah, oh yeah,
I remember one of my fond programs with PR in Asheville was he was a member of the Sons of the Confederacy, and he invited me to do their program, and I was honored to get to do that.
Oh, he was very faithful to because all of his relatives had fought.
But the town families in Mars Hill, do you remember any of those?
Well, the Stringfields.
also-
Stringfields were something.
But also, he was looking at, he had this store in Marshall, so he could have gone the river road to Asheville, to North Asheville, to
Exactly.
the Beaver Lake
Yeah.
And we looked at some lots. I remember looking at the lots. I was really young. But he decided to move to Mars Hill because of the college. And the
I'm glad he
preparatory, the preparatory school, or the music school, everybody took music for fun.
Yes.
Music was fun. And all the Lyceum series in this book, I realize they don't have those anymore.
No, that's
a shame.
Yeah, it is a shame.
My
One of the
mother
things
slammed her
that's-
finger in the door, taking me down so I could hear some music program that they were having.
Before I forget to put one more thing in your list of things Janis did at Mars Hill, she was the freshman queen, the rat queen,
Ah,
and rode on the fire engine.
Really?
Well,
Yes, and there
that's
was a
what they wanted
parade
me to do
behind
rather
her.
than a convertible.
But here's where it connects, is of course my dad crowned her on the football
On the
field, and I have a picture of it.
he didn't know what was going to develop from that. What was it like to piggyback to Richard here? I've tried to imagine growing up in Mars Hill, in the area when you all were growing up. What was the social life like? Obviously you knew families, and people have said that this town, that in fact some of the faculty wives said, well, we were the mothers to all the children. You know, they came to our house, we told them what to do and they did it, and it was
Well,
like
you
a
said
village.
just yesterday when we were eating with Sam Hutchins down at, that the church was obviously the center of social activity.
Activity. And Elwood Roberts
Oh, yeah.
did the choir, and he would take us to the choir festivals. That was our ticket out of town, kind of. And we went to Caswell, to the beach every summer, to choir camp.
But did you go into actual date for go to a movie or
Oh,
something?
yeah.
Yeah.
That was where you went.
That was where you went.
Once
To
you
the
could-
Plaza Theater.
Once you either
or
had
the
a car
other
or could borrow a car.
At what point were you given permission to take a car, to go away from town?
Well, as soon as I could
Well,
drive,
16,
they
yeah.
trusted us, and they didn't have much reason not to.
Well, and we had curfews. We had to be home. In fact, after junior year, after the prom and the dance or whatever, we could only go to HB's. I don't think HB's is there anymore, but it was there for a long time.
On this side of Asheville.
On this side of Asheville was as far as we could go because I had to be back by midnight.
Did you feel that because of the towns being very small, that you were in any way deprived of not living in a big,
I was
We were
deprived of not being
creative.
able to misbehave.
Yes, that's true.
Well,
everybody knew you.
yeah. My mother's theory was, and she always told me, and this is true, and I've told my children, it's not what you do, it's what people think you do
Yeah.
that gives you your reputation.
Yeah, that's a
So
tough-
you
that's
don't
a
hang
tough-
out with people that are doing things that you shouldn't be doing, even though if you're not doing them with them. You know, that's, and you know, everybody has a good and bad, and so that, you know.
Well, looping back to
But
the
that was
families
true.
for a minute, I do want to mention the Stringfields, because they were, I think, so important to the state, because their house was right where the Methodist church is, almost exactly, as I recall. And of course, all the family were artists and musicians, and Preston Stringfield, known as Pop, I guess Pop Stringfield, was the college photographer. I assume officially, maybe unofficially, I don't know.
Most of the
Yeah,
old
super
historic
character.
photographs we
Yeah.
have in the archives were probably.
Well,
And
I found a
his
lovely-
fingernails were brown because he didn't wear gloves when he developed his own pictures.
Yeah,
And-
his dark room, there's a garage right at where the loop road now goes to the Methodist church. There was a similar kind of thing for the house, and there was a garage down at the road, so you didn't have to take the car up the dirt road. And he converted that into a dark room. And when I was about 12, he took me in with him and showed me what he was doing, and I think that's one reason I'm interested in photography even now. But that whole family, again, I think it was his brother, Lamar,
Lamar is the one
He was a
that
flute player.
organized the North Carolina Symphony.
Founding.
Founder of that,
And wrote music that had roots in the mountains.
of course, yeah.
Cripple Creek, I think.
He used the theme from Cripple Creek to read that he got the Pulitzer Prize for.
Yes.
And I won't go into tell.
And then I just noticed recently that he and Joe DiNardo, do you remember?
Yes, they did.
DiNardo?
Yeah.
Had a connection
In Asheville.
Yes, they did.
in the military.
Yes, they did before they came
Overseas.
here. Overseas. That's how he accepted the flute as his major instrument.
Yes.
I
I
didn't
had one
realize that.
flute lesson with him when I was again
Oh,
about
you were
12.
Really,
And I gave the flute to a nephew and it's disappeared, but I would love to have it because he actually made a mark showing how to align the head with the body.
Yeah.
That's Lamar Stringfield's scratch.
I knew his sister, Miss Bernice.
Well, she lived up over the
She
store
did.
there
In
for
fact,
many years.
when I got a job for Grace Gibbs, she gave me the room upstairs across from Bernice.
Yes.
We used to visit
Bernice still had the
our Sunday
refrigerator
school
that had the
classes.
round
Yes.
coil on top. And my mother used to send me down with goodies.
And Mr. McKay, her husband, did not appreciate her music. So when he was out on the street, he was using a crutch because he lost one leg working for the railroad. So when he was out on the street, she would knock on my door, said, Richard, would you like a concert? And I said, I would love one. And so I would go into her apartment and she would play that piano for Richard.
Yes, I remember that she had a piano.
Uh-huh.
I also remember when I knew her, it was scary. I was a little kid and I was asked to take this food down. I didn't really know who she was. She was losing her hair. She had just little wisps.
She lost all of it, and the problem was they gave her vitamins and all of it came back.
Well, and I'd heard that she had bad teeth.
Yes.
And when they corrected that problem,
Everything
that
had
and
happened.
the supplements then, and then, sure enough, the last time I saw her, she had black. It came back
Yes.
black, not gray.
In this,
Do you think that would? Oh, never.
it might work.
Maybe, do you play the piano?
I do.
Good, keep it up.
Well,
Yes.
to continue that story, Doris Bentley called me one day and she said, see, Robert, I have some books which I think you might want to put in your collection over in the musical theater library. And I went to see her and she gave me a stack of very nice albums of songs. And she says, I got these from
Bernice.
That's right. And so I got those books, and they're still on campus in the musical theater collection. But the story goes on in other peculiar ways because the McKays figure into the story I told in Treasures.
Really?
Yes. When I was doing the research on the musical I wrote for the Sesquicentennial, I kept running into all these references. Mars Hill was all over the place because of the Helen McMaster, who was the heroine of my story. But anyway, that's another story as well. But you know, it's like incest. Everywhere you turn, somebody is a part of somebody else's either history or life or family.
Well, it is.
Fascinating.
And we love that about this area up here. I mean, her mother's maiden name was Julia English Roberts. My mother's maiden name was Olive English Brown. It's the same
It's
English.
the same English,
Yes.
but we knew,
Yeah, so
we
we're like
knew
fourth
that they
cousins.
both had
Those are good genes.
English
Yeah,
as
and
their...
Wiseman, we're kin through the Wiseman as well, so we're like double fourth cousins. And that explains our children.
When you guys grew up in Mars Hill was the cultural and the economic center of the greater area here until they
It was
began
definitely
opening.
the
Looking
cultural
back on it,
center.
I mean, geographically, no more beautiful place on earth.
Yes.
I could come home from school when I was 9 years old and go up a little mountain and wander as far as I
We
wanted.
walked to our friends' houses.
Nobody worried about me.
So nobody,
Yeah.
you know, it took time to get
And
over
then
to
you
see
could come down
Peggy
to
Jo and the
campus,
other ridge,
And there would
but
be Shakespeare and
Tell me the faculty,
Music.
the kids you were involved with.
well, Bob Wood would be one of them.
Oh, my.
exactly, and he's come back.
Yeah, y'all
Yeah.
knew Courtney very well. She was in your
Yes,
class.
no, I know, she was a year behind
Was she a
me.
year behind?
Uh-huh.
Right. And that,
But I knew
what
her.
town did Jay Flippin and Corny and the Richardson boy all came from this same little town in Virginia that
Yep.
had this one woman music teacher.
Yeah, she told me that. Courtney told me that. I do not remember what it
Yeah.
was.
So,
It's Southern Virginia.
Yeah.
but let's see, who else had children?
Richardson was what?
Who else had children our age?
The Smiths, and he
Yes.
ran the Cleaners.
Right.
Eddie
And
Smith.
Eddie Smith and
Charlie's
Peggy Jo's
coming in
hair,
tomorrow, and I'll be
her
reading
clothes were
Oh,
always
good.
starched
Tomorrow.
and because
Tell
they
him
got.
we
Let me turn to something a little bit more serious. I don't know whether people think of Dr. Blackwell in these terms necessarily, but during his tenure here in those 28 years, 3 incredible things happened because of history that he would not have been able to foresee, I don't think. First one was World War II. He had just become president, you know, a few years before, and then suddenly he is having to navigate. Everything went south. The campus turned into a level, young men here on campus doing training. The college was turned over to use by the military, by the government. The population changed. There were mostly women here during that period because the men were all away. Even the faculty people ended up serving because that was a thing. that he negotiated all that. And of course, what was happening is he's raising money, or started raising money for buildings, and then he has to stop because you can't get supplies, there's no gas, and you don't have workmen. So all that just stopped dead. So he had to keep the school going through what was, to me, probably the most difficult time. Those 4 or 5 years in there were dicey. Of course, once the war was over and students began coming back, it was a whole different ballgame. And he picked back up very quickly with the building plans and whatever else. But the next thing that hit during his time, which to me was so significant, and people, nowadays just take it for granted, he was here and oversaw integration. That was huge.
Yes, we remember that.
Talk to me about that from your perspective, as you saw it.
Well, it goes way back. As you know, there's this book called A Genealogy of Dissent. Do you know that book? It's about the liberal wing of the Southern Baptists. And it goes back to see Walt N. Johnson.
Walter Johnson.
Yeah, who lived in a little cabin down what used to be the tennis courts down below Edgewood down there, just this little shack.
And finally built his home behind the Moore House.
I didn't know that.
That house is still standing.
Right. But he influenced so many people. They were having ashrams, I think they call them here, where people from, the
East
Indian
Jones
tribes.
was present for one of them.
Right, and the black community would all get together, they'd eat together, they'd live in the dorms together, and this was like 1940-ish.
In the 30s.
Yeah.
In the 30s.
So then from there, this book points out that people influenced a lot of people. Carlisle Marney was one, Seymour, Bob Seymour, who was our pastor, and so influential on us growing up. And even my brother.
Still is. He's in his 90s, and we keep in touch with him. He came back to do my mother's funeral because he'd been asked before, but he was trying to keep his new life separate. But he came back to do her funeral, and then he came back to do my father's funeral. He was in his 80s.
But you guys grew up under those great people. That's
Yes.
what's
Well,
so
Yes,
amazing.
and
We
they
did.
were
And then Martin
meaningful
England,
to
of
us.
course,
Yes.
that name, Martin
His
England
daughter
is
agreed.
a
Last
historian
year,
himself.
She published the history of that.
Who did?
His daughter.
Oh, really?
The
Okay.
college bookstore is selling.
Well, Martin and Hoyt were roommates at Mars Hill.
Great.
And were good friends throughout their lives. And of course, it was Martin and Clarence Jordan, spelled Jordan, but I think pronounced Jordan, that founded Koinonia Farms. And out of that came everything from Habitat for Humanity. One reason Jimmy Carter still works for it is a little boy used to walk from over to Americus or wherever the place was.
But all that's the Morris Hill heritage.
Exactly. That's all. But so that's what leads into this integration of Mars Hill itself. Dad, yeah, he was there, and Dad had to deal with the trustees. But it was honestly, I think, Bob Seymour that was the motivating factor to say now is the time. I never heard Dad talk about it directly, so what I'm hearing is the same stuff you've probably seen and read.
And he was the first in the South and in North Carolina to accept Pembroke Indians and others. Dr. Blackwell found out at the convention that no other Baptist school was doing that. He said, well, Mars Hill.
And one of those guys was our Royal Ambassador teacher.
Really?
Who went on to be a physician down in, it was Lumbee, actually.
Yes, Lumbee.
Lumbee Indians.
And I'll go up with his name in a minute, because I remember exactly what it
And
was.
didn't one of them get killed on a sled?
Yes.
I remember that, because we were.
Pastor Davis came to my room and knocked on the door, and he says, we've had a sled accident. Would you please go to the hospital?
Well, that was just right here.
Yes, I know.
Yes,
this.
it was right here at the intersection.
Yes, sir.
I'm turned around anyway.
And so I dressed quickly and went with him, and the boy died that night
Mhm.
Well,
in the hospital.
this is a leap away again, but because of that, the only other death that I remember was there was a Cuban student who drowned in the swimming pool.
That was in McConnell before they closed the
That's
pool
right.
house.
And Dad went to Cuba
Really?
to
I
talk
didn't
with the
know that.
family.
Really?
Yeah. And I've never seen him look more sad than
Yeah.
taking that news and then knowing that he had to see them face to face.
Would you like to hear my opinion as to why Mars Hill College has been this exceptional place as it relates to values and what's happened in integration? I mean, we're still in the South, but we're not in the South. Those pioneer settlers who came here with land trust and all, they were part of the pioneering of the West. So they came here with Western values. Even though we're in the South, we have Western values, egalitarianism, no big dog, no little dog. So that permeated not only our school and our church and these other things. So even though we were in the South, we had these Western values that helped us to escape the bigotry of these other values. So
But
that's
we
my
certainly
opinion.
experienced that within the Baptist realm per se. I mean, we grew up in a Baptist church. It was our life, you know, and everything we did was centered there.
But it was first and foremost Christian, not
It
Baptist.
was,
Exactly,
and it reflected
exactly.
those liberal values,
Yeah.
going back probably to Walt Johnson and those people. And when we moved away, we tried going to the Baptist church in several places, and it was, you know, we ended up in the Presbyterian church for a while, and then eventually the Episcopal church. My dad, in a sense of humor, asked me if we were in the Church of the Month plan at one point.
But Albert had gone to the Episcopal Church in Greenville, so he pretty much had paved the way for us when we started going to the Episcopal
Well, I'll
Church.
tell you what Albert said about that, and I remember it well, is he said one reason that he went to the Episcopal Church was that it was missing the cult of the minister. It was not so much the minister that set the agenda as the minister was just part of the, you know, ecumenical approach and the liturgical year. And we honored the liturgical year here, which a lot of
We
Baptist
did,
churches
and
don't.
I remember specifically Seymour would wear his robes
Yes.
and with the,
So I'll send you a picture of my dad and Seymour sitting on the new church
On the new church.
podium, or whatever you call it.
When
in the
Dr.
church.
Seymour came and did his trial sermon at Morris Hill, his publication said that he was very anxious about coming into this rural, conservative setting and everything. And Professor McLeod came up to him and says, "Now, we are unusual here. You can say or do anything you want to, and nobody else pays any attention."
Except not to do it.
And so Dr. Seymour in his
Good
publication said that's
Well-
one of the reasons I accepted that pastorship.
well, as
Well,
a,
and
I
what
think we
an
were about
influence, I
10
mean-
years old, and we had permission to sit up in the balcony by ourselves. So we were up in the balcony, and this nice looking, he had a flat top and an English accent, because he had just come from Oxford, I guess.
Edinburgh.
Or Edinburgh. And, yeah, he was just phenomenal, and he found his wife here.
Yeah, the
She
organist,
was the
Pearl,
organist.
what was her maiden name?
Girl
Francis.
Francis from
yeah.
Nashville, Tennessee.
Yeah.
Tell me
John
about
Huff,
excuse me.
John Huff had the same experience you did at UFF, Dorothy, and he couldn't find a church. He had to search for a church. He said there was not any church in the place he was in Georgia that was like the Mars Hill Baptist
No,
Church.
no, and of course,
And he says that
you
today.
don't know that growing up. This
No,
was the
you
church, and it
think
was
that's the
Baptist.
church,
Just like your
and
family.
I went to Glorietta, and people would say amen, you know, and stuff, you know, it was different, you know, we didn't do that.
didn't do that.
It was more
Well, we do
formal.
have somebody that says amen now.
Yeah,
Well, that's
Do
good.
you?
I have nothing against it.
I don't
It's not
either,
what
I
we
don't
do.
either, but it was just different. Then I realized that all the Baptist churches were the same.
But one more thing on the integration thing, again, I think it was Seymour that really pushed that. Dad's feeling, I think honestly, was that the Board of Trustees was not quite ready to make that decision. And I think it was Bob Seymour's influence that said, no, the time is probably right. And of course, then it was Seymour that convinced, who's the
Binkley?
Carolina basketball
Dean
coach?
Smith.
Dean Smith, to
Dean
take the
Smith.
first black basketball player at
Yeah,
Carolina.
well, Dean also helped break the color barrier at the Pines, which was the premier restaurant in Chapel
Chapel
Hill.
Hill.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Coach
he-
was member of the Bentley.
Well, he was. In
Yeah,
fact, I was-
Binkley
when I was
Church.
at Duke,
Exactly.
I would drive over for church to Binkley Church in Chapel Hill. It's only 15 minutes from where I live.
My first cousin,
And,
who was in that area, she's a
yeah.
member of that church.
And the coach was a regular, he'd be one of the ushers, you know, and he was there every Sunday, even if they'd had a home game. He wasn't there if they'd had an away game. But
That church was named for Pauline
Pauline
Sheik's father.
Sheik's father.
Yes, yes, because her middle name, her maiden name
And
was
she was
Binkley.
back in the news about something recently, a project or something about her. or-
She's working on all kinds of projects, even though she's in terminal therapy for cancer. And she and her husband, I think, have bought again in Morris Hill.
Really, I'm glad. I didn't know
Really?
that was right here.
Really?
Dr. Seymour, you mentioned that name, is it was interesting in the interview we did with Earl Lady Graves Simmons.
Oh, yeah.
She talks about his involvement in that process for her.
Oh, I don't know any of this. I would love to hear what
It's,
you know.
it's, I think it's in the, no, you don't have a copy of that
No,
interview.
no, we only have
Maybe
one.
I can find it and send it. She talks about that, and he was very instrumental in that for her, and she praises his getting it moving in a way that probably wouldn't have happened.
Well, and he said he took his little daughter, 8-year-old or something, daughter to, with all of her birthday group to the skating rink, and he realized there were no black children skating. It was in Chapel Hill, and he asked the management if blacks were allowed, and they said no, and he took the skating
Right.
birthday party and he left.
Good for him.
So he just always took a stand.
Great, good for him.
I
Another
tell you
thing-
one interesting story though, Pearl was a big, because of Dean, she was a super Carolina fan.
Oh,
And
uh-huh.
Carolina was playing at 12 o'clock in Raleigh in the NCAA tournament. Dean had tried to get it changed, he'd done everything to try to get it changed.
Uh-huh.
Now, I don't know what the correct answer is, but Pearl either went to the game or when the game started, she had the radio next to her organ while she was playing. I do not know
I'm so
which
glad
story
to-
is true.
I'm so glad to hear that. Interesting, I noticed your shirt is somewhere between Duke and Carolina blue. Is that?
Yeah, notice his tie has Norrisville University.
Yeah.
Oh, so that ties it literally all together.
The other of those three things I noted about Dr. Blackwell's time here, and this must have been probably the most stressful for him, was the changeover from the junior to senior college, because he had to see that through. I went back and read Mr. Mack's version of how all that happened in his book about the college, and it took a long time for that process to happen. It was just not overnight. Going through the Baptist hierarchy to get them to approve and looking out for money, and then the accreditation process and all that stuff. Do you remember that at all? Do you remember his ever, because you all were gone by then.
Well, she was here through the transition.
Well,
She was in
that's
the
right.
first class,
Well, but
first
you were-
four-year class.
Yeah,
I
but you
would
were
have been
here.
if I was here for 2 of those years. I knew it was the work in progress, and to me, it just seemed like that's logical, that's what should be done. I never gave it much thought. And only in reading Harlan Jolly's interview where he talks about the fact that we went from being a premier junior college to who knows this
Yeah.
senior college was a tough transition.
There is a master's thesis from Chapel Hill in their collection written about the years of transition from junior college to senior college. And that master's thesis, he interviewed everybody that was anybody in that process, including the president, Dr. Blackwell. And it was interesting because it implies in there that the faculty and the administration did not accept the recommendation of the North Carolina Baptist Convention that it transfer without sufficient funds to make that transition with faculty and library and everything else. Well,
So they were saying that that money should be identified before
exactly,
the
before the
process.
process, but the process was forced on, and they agreed to have Mr. Hutchins, who eventually wrote the history of North Carolina Baptist, that he was going to raise the monies among North Carolina Baptists to pay for this transition. Well, he got called into another system, got the money for writing the history, and he pulled out, and so the raising of those monies to convert it to a senior college never happened. So Mars Hill was forced with Dr. Blackwell and Benton to move into accreditation for a senior college without any major Baptist funds of any kind for library, for faculty, for anything.
Well, I'm glad, I'm
There's a master's read that.
glad to know it, maybe is not the right term, but I'm glad to have that information.
But
Because,
it was
see,
very,
I
very
had left, and by that time I was off.
It's very difficult.
On my own
But
path.
Dr. Blackwell's connections, we made it possible, and then Bentley came in and finally got accredited.
Yeah, I've said that, talking this interview, we have, okay, we grew up here, we know that. Then we've been gone forever. We don't know much about that. And then I've gotten interested in it again, but now what I really know is looking back through my mother's photographs, and she was so diligent about saying what
Putting
they
the
were on the
names
back.
and
And looking at these
clippings.
books again, reading again from these stones, and reading Ken Sanford's book again. And there's more of my family history in Ken Sanford's book than I ever did growing up.
Yes.
So,
Let me ask you, when the transition did happen and Dr. Blackwell decided to retire and Dr. Bentley came in, you've got an incredibly different dynamic here. A young man who's the youngest college president of the United States compared to your father.
The basketball player.
Right. Your father, who is a man of the old school, I guess one could say, who was very proper and very dignified and so forth. And his approach was very different. Did you perceive, they're living next door now, did you perceive this dynamic to be difficult for your family or your father?
Well, again, as we talked about, Dad didn't
He
tell you,
didn't
Dad
complain.
didn't tell you much about what was on
He
his
didn't
mind.
complain.
There, I know a few particular things that took place that represented a pretty big change in the way that campus was run that disturbed him. But he, as far as I know, his goal was to completely stay out of Dr. Bentley's way, and I hope he lived up to that. I don't know of any cases personally where he didn't, where he tried to
I think
interfere.
he tried not to intervene.
Yeah,
And that would make sense.
but I'm sure it was
And then
difficult.
Doris had grown up here, and she was more laid back,
Well,
and she was
Hannah were
more
classmates, were in
conservative,
the
I
choir
think.
together.
And I think that was a help.
It was a
I
great
might,
help.
you know, when you came back and you saw, you know, she
Yeah.
was stable and,
Right.
you know.
Doris was one class behind Hannah.
Really?
Hannah and I were in the same class.
Oh,
Well, I knew
really?
that, I think
Yeah.
Doris and Hannah were in the choir together. That's
Yeah,
what I know.
would, that,
Yeah, I didn't know
that
actually
doesn't
that they were the
surprise
same,
me at all.
same class.
One of the things, and I may be going astray from what Sue Robert wants to do, but the thing that amazed me when I came back was how dominant the music program was. I mean, the Bob Hopkins was the head of the music program,
Uh-huh.
and in some ways, he was like the vice president, because the music program was so highly thought of. I came in to start teacher education, and I go to his office to tell him how he's going to do with the music education program, and I think he's ready to shoot me. It's pretty close to it, because he had a super dominant position on campus.
I never really knew, I took piano lessons with him, but I, of course, never knew what was going on behind the scenes.
In fact,
So
How did that
when
play
did you
out?
come back here? What year did you
I
come?
came in '62.
Uh-huh.
62.
I came when the college had its first junior class.
Mm-hmm.
Francis Nelson brought me back. You know, Francis Nelson also was the reason I was a student here.
Really?
Oh yes,
Now where?
we did the. They had the superintendent's conference, the North Carolina
I wanted to
superintendents,
mention
and
that
Let me finish this.
my dad was a superintendent,
Mhm.
and Francis looked after us every year. And I thought I was going to Wake Forest. And my daddy told me at the last minute I was coming to Mars Hill. I didn't have any choice. Of course, it's not like today where the kids have so much influence.
Yeah,
But one of the funny things that happened to me though, we had a faculty thing, the supper, whatever, dinner, the night before classes start. And I ended up by Mr. McLeod. And Mr. McLeod spent the whole night telling me why this institution didn't need a teacher education program.
Oh,
well, welcome to Mars Hill.
Well, if I had not been a student here and knew Mr. Mackerel, well, it probably would have thrown me. As it was, I laughed all night long
Right.
because he not only told me, but he had such a great sense of humor in telling you.
And then you actually were the one who came back and built that program.
Well, my brother was at Harvard at one point and had put a Harvard decal on the back of Dad's car that was actually a college car, I think. So it had Dad's Mars Hill thing on the front and the Harvard thing on the back. Mr. Mack came, and he talked to himself, you know, he was walking around town. Came out of the post office one day and Dad's car was parked there, and to nobody in particular, he looks at it and says, oh, Mars Hill on one end, Harvard on the other. That's a joke, he said.
Tell us about your mom. You know,
Well, I interrupted Janice when she was going to tell something, because we
Well,
talked
no,
about
I think
how important the superintendent's conference and.
the summer programs, because I read in the book, I don't know how many summer programs you all still have. I know the hostel program has changed names
That's right.
from reading.
yeah.
But the superintendent's conference, for people growing up in Mars Hill, we all had cafeteria jobs for the special conferences, or I babysat during the superintendent's job, because it was a huge conference. And everybody brought their kids, and my sister handed out Cokes. That was one of the
They had
club
free ice
jobs.
cream.
And
Yes.
they had free ice cream, the
The
Dairy
Boy Scouts
Council.
carried their luggage into
Yeah.
the girls' dorms.
And it was
Every state
huge PR for Mars Hill to have all these superintendents for all the whole state
Well, you said
coming
it'd
to
be a
the
pretty
campus,
specific
being on the
example.
campus,
Yeah.
You're right.
you know.
They have that student government meeting here of all the student governments from the high schools across the state.
Oh,
really?
my goodness, so that's the
That's
best
good.
of the students from
It's-
those
yeah,
high schools.
It's in its 52nd or 3rd
I
year,
know.
I think, that they've had it, oh yeah, and it started under Dr. Blackwell.
Yeah.
Oh,
That's a
It's
big
okay.
still
deal.
coming, and
Yeah,
it was
big
2
deal.
weeks ago here, it just covers the whole campus.
I was going to ask you about your mom. They say behind every successful man is an incredible woman. And everybody talks about your mom in their writings. But they always say she was very sweet and very quiet and it stayed in the background. Talk about her. She must have had incredible influence that we don't know about.
Well, this goes back to my grandfather Brown, her father, the guy that was the orphan that then became a successful businessman and everything else. Again, she had worked in his store pretty much as the accountant, taking care of business in the back office for 10 years. And so in their marriage, my dad's marriage with her, she took care of all of that stuff. You know, she's the one that managed the checkbook and got the taxes done and all that. And again, that's totally out of sight and behind the scenes, but it was that platform then on which Dad didn't have to mess with any of that stuff.
When they got married, she said, she went down to his office. He wanted her to come down to his office to help him organize some things. And he had the bookcase, she said, turned on its side. And he just had things stacked like that. So she helped him organize his office. And anytime Dad would say, you know, why don't we take the Blackwells riding in the country? And Dr. Blackwell would say, I have to ask Olive, and I'll get back
This
to
was
you."
when they were on up in years, and her
Mhm.
dad was so faithful to come up and visit and get them out of the house. And Mother was very reserved about most things, and Dad was just so glad to have any opportunity to get out, because he didn't have any opportunity. And PR would come up and say, well, let's go for a drive, and Dad would say, yeah, oh, and then he'd say, no, I need to ask Olive, and I would think about it, you know, for a while.
But yeah, and she managed their finances, right?
She did, well, she just ran the house, she, you know.
How long did she teach the Sunday school class?
Oh, goodness, I can't even answer that.
I bet,
No, I
it's,
mean-
I bet it's over 30 years.
Probably,
I don't know.
yeah.
Yes, I just know Mother was in the young marrieds class for
But what I was going to
30
say is,
years.
going back to her father, he saw that all of his children were educated. He said, I will pay for as much education as you will make use of, and that included the girls, which was a little unusual back in the 20s. And so Mom went to Carson Newman College. I'm wondering if there's overlap where the president might be Oscar Sands, for whom the Oscar Sands who then was here as a vice
That's
president.
right.
You know, later on. So she was well educated. She spoke, if I have any defects in my English speaking, it is not because of her. It's because I drifted. She read to us as children, read to us and read to us and read to us. So if I have a vocabulary, it's because of her. And again, you don't think about this. You think everybody's mother does that. Maybe, you know, I hope they do. But, so she was just the rock. I mean, she was what held us, the glue that held us together. And Dad's love, and I don't know of any other way to talk about it, was so all-encompassing and so without reservation and generous. He used to embarrass me. I mean, he'd pick me up at school and kiss me on the cheek, you know. And I look back on that now and think, what a blessing, you know.
Well, and he used to throw us kisses when we would come home to visit on the weekends and leave. He would throw us kisses, and she was more reserved, but she was also very loving. And
But so she was well educated in the fact that they did this honeymoon that was basically the grand tour of Europe. And from Dad's standpoint, specific visits to things of theological interest.
Right.
He went to Ur of the Chaldees. He went to, I have a picture of him getting off of a bus in the Syrian desert so that the Muslims on board, Muslims, could do their prayers. And so he made all of those pilgrimages. And then one place I'm not sure you mentioned in his education was New College in Edinburgh, which was a theological college.
And that's really what they went to Europe for.
Was to go to Edinburgh.
And she enrolled also
She
Good.
did.
and took class.
So, I mean, I had an unusually well-educated mom. And all of us, the three of us growing up in that house, I think if anything that we've accomplished goes back to not so much the public schools, because we were always a little bit ahead because mom already had us doing all that stuff, you know. So school was easy and you could spend time with your piano lessons or whatever and not be behind what you needed.
You alluded in passing very quickly a while ago about sneaking away from Mars Hill to go away to another school, which turned out to be Wake Forest, wasn't it?
No?
Where did you go first?
Oh, this is a long story. You sure you want to
Yes.
go with it? Okay. I went to Harvard from here
Okay,
as an English major.
okay.
He switched his major, he was a math major, and we had Miss Eric, and she was wonderful, and
Oh,
I
she was
just found out she's recently died.
She did, she did.
But, yeah, she was wonderful, so he switched his major to English, and at Mars Hill, he had read everything. You were given a book to read, you read
You
it.
read it, yeah.
Well, at
My
Harvard,
first semester at Harvard, I came out with a bookstore, you know, with 80 pounds of books that were the assignment.
and he thought he had to
Proceeded
read
to
every
start
one
to-
of them.
Well, I found out later that all the rest of the guys didn't do anything. They partied, and then there was a long break, like a 4-week
Uh-huh.
break right before the exams, and that's when they did all their work. But I wasn't properly indoctrinated into the procedures.
And he had to wear glasses after that semester.
Really? So you
Because he read so much, yeah.
You read too much.
I did. Well, anyway, it was a horrible experience in the one sense of being a place where I didn't belong, felt totally unprepared. I was with all these prep school guys. My
And
timing, as far as
Adam's
getting in,
house.
just happened to be just right because it was when Harvard first said, okay, we're going to quit taking all prep school guys.
Yeah.
We're going to go out and find people in the Carolina Hills.
There you are.
And so,
He said
but
he
on
was
the other
nervous.
hand, it was a great experience in that it showed me my limits. It pushed me up to my limits. And I think it's not too bad to be pushed there if you don't go, if you don't
Right.
fall off the
Well,
edge.
his brother was there in Boston at
Yeah,
the time.
well, and my brother-in-law and my sister.
Uh-huh.
So it was like getting up there. But anyway, so after that, I came back. They allowed me to, quote, not drop out, but take a leave of absence. I dropped out. And then I went to Duke. I had already been accepted at Duke when I was accepted at Harvard. And I went back, you know, hat in hand, please, I've made a mistake.
So you
Because my parents were paying full tuition, they said,
Yes.
I mean, I had no illusions about anything.
When was it along the way you realized that your interest was in medical things or headed?
Well, it was the
Oh,
day I
tell
met
that.
Shelby Vance, when Bob Vance, my friend growing up, Shelby was the, you know, regional physician that just traveled around the hills, took his payment in chickens and
Yes,
hogs.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And I just thought that
Had
would
an
be a great
office in
thing to do,
Marshall.
you know. Well, then, of course, as I got closer to the actual process, I realized there are some pretty heavy decisions you have to make about the courses you're gonna take to prepare and all of that. And one thing that happened that was really a good thing in my life was at Duke, I was part of the Baptist Student Union, or whatever it was called. It was, it wasn't BSU, it was actually just the Baptist Students Association. There was a little house off campus where we would have events, and so I felt very comfortable there. And Bob Hyatt, I don't know if that name means anything to you, who actually helped with our wedding,
Uh-huh.
was the
He-
person managing that at the time. And Bob's talked to me about my interests and everything and said, well, there's this program available through the Rockefeller Foundation where you can apply for a trial year in seminary. Because that was my interest. I thought I either wanted to be a pastor or maybe chaplain in a college or in a hospital or whatever. So I applied for that, and with Hyatt's help, I got it and went to Union Seminary. And let me tell you this, I went to Union Seminary in New
Really? I
York.
didn't know that.
My dad had been to Union
Yes,
Seminary.
yes.
And he never mentioned that. I mean, you know, wouldn't you, if your kid is just
He
accepted?
was
It's
like
oh,
my
I
father, and I said, Dad, why didn't you tell me that? And he said, I just assume you know what I know, and if you didn't know it, you'd ask me.
Well,
How-
so anyway, that was a really good experience. That was in New York City, and again, a good experience for a country boy to have a little bit of exposure to the city and what was going on.
Gorgeous campus.
It is. It's right across from the Riverside Church on one side and Columbia University on
Well,
the
and
other.
the Jewish.
Jewish Theological Seminary of America is
Oh, yeah,
directly
and
across
there's
the
another
street.
one there too, because there are 3 or 4 seminaries.
Well, and the old Juilliard School used to
Yeah.
be there before they moved to Lincoln City.
But their Old Testament professor was from the Jewish seminary.
It was
It was
designed
Rabbi Ben Heschel. who
like
was so
either
involved in
Edinburgh or
racial-
Oxford one. The guy who did it was copying from England, either Oxford or Edinburgh.
Uh-huh.
My cousin was president,
And
So
what
I-
name was that?
Joe Hough.
Joe.
Yeah,
Oh.
Of Union?
yeah, he was president of Union. He was 65 by the time he took it, so,
Uh-huh.
and he lives in California now. But they started borrowing from their endowment.
Really?
They were having some serious problems. And Joe went, and after the recession was over, he built them back. And Columbia University now leases 3 of their buildings.
Really?
That's what really saved them. Columbia did a 99-year lease
Uh-huh.
Oh, my goodness.
on 3 of the buildings, including the library, which elevated the Columbia Library from like 7th or 8th in the world to 3 because of all the books that are in the Union Library.
Well, I was only there for a year. I did decide in the course of that year that I really did want to do medicine and got all my applications in, and by the grace of God, got into somewhere, which happened to be Wake Forest. And so I did end up at Wake Forest eventually, but they call it the Bowman Grace.
Right.
But he also went to Wake Forest on a rental scholarship.
To the
Well,
med school.
They gave 5, and he had one of
So
them.
you-
It was a full
Yeah,
ride.
incredible. So at Bowman Gray, or at Wake Forest, what were you specializing in there at that point?
Well, of course, I was just a med student, and you rotate through all the services, and I liked every service I ever rotated through. It's like, oh, psychiatry, yeah, this is great. Oh, surgery, wow, look at this. So after I'd been through all of them, I decided neurology, as in strokes and epilepsy, might be interesting, and I actually was accepted into that residency. And first couple of months I was in the residency, this crate showed up on the doorstep and turned out to be a piece of ultrasound equipment for looking at the carotid arteries.
Yeah.
And so I volunteered to do a research project with it. Then they started a multidisciplinary ultrasound program, and I was their first guinea pig. So I never finished the urology residency. I ended up in ultrasound. Bizarre.
And they've loved it.
And they've loved it, absolutely loved it.
Well, and they thought that ultrasound would be a board certification.
Uh-huh.
And it is in some countries, but they started putting the ultrasound questions on the different boards.
Yeah, I was on the group making up those questions, so I would have been grandfathered, in.
So they were waiting for them to be grandfathered in.
It's a long political story, but basically nuclear medicine had just done the same thing and caused so much friction between radiology, pathology, and everybody that wanted a piece of it. Everybody was just tired of fighting.
It's interesting that your interest in medicine may have begun here in Mars Hill.
Oh, it certainly did. I mean, Bob
Stories
Vance's,
that I could
Bob
tell you.
Vance's dad
Yeah,
was
when
my hero.
McLeod was my pastor at Piney Mountain. His son entered college here and absolutely flunked out the first semester. So Mr. Mack told him he's going to have to stay out for 1 whole semester and go with him on every church visit and everything. So they ended up at my home, and my mother was bedfast. She was very ill.
Uh-huh.
And John McLeod was with him. They came in there, well, he didn't say anything into him. So I noticed when he left, he went over and McLeod shook hands with my mother, and I was about 7 or 8 years old. And John put something in my mother's hand. And so I go over there, and Mother showed it to him. It was a dollar bill. John went from that semester out and got his doctorate in medicine and developed Mission Hospital in Asheville, North Carolina. as a result.
And his sister had the gallery
You had to go.
where Stackhouse.
Yes, yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
I
What
can't
was your
believe the
mother's?
education you got. Talk about going from school to school. You got
Well, I'm sort of-
unbelievable.
Well,
I told you about the
Union,
Church of the
though.
Month Club. I sort of had the College of the Month Club.
Well,
Oh.
but when he was at Union, he wrote medical ethic papers. Is what his interest
Wow.
was all the
Union,
time.
I have
right?
to say just a couple of things about Union. I walked in the door, again, I was there, I picked it, I had like 10 places I could pick from. I didn't know much about any of them. But I thought it'd be nice to be in New York City, so I picked Union. And I walked in the first day and they got all the new people together and said, well, what is it you want to learn this year and how can we help you? Well, I've been pre-med. They say, this is what you'll do this year and you will dang well do well or you're not going to get into med school. Nobody ever said, what do you want to learn and how? And it really changed the way I thought about it. So I had, there's a story I'll tell you off camera later, but Edmund Steinley, who was one of the preachers for the Protestant hour, the Lutheran representative, was one of my teachers. And then I had a Professor Johnson who was blind, who was our ethics professor. And the two of them said if I wanted to work on a bigger project, I could let it count for both of their requirements. And they both helped me with it. And so I wrote a thing called Reverence for Human Life, pretty, reflecting Albert Schweitzer's Reverence for Life thing. And it really helped me sort out a lot of things, think about it.
Harvard.
Harvard,
He
Duke,
didn't-
from
he didn't
Harvard to Duke to Union,
But
you
at
know, to
Harvard,
Wake Forest.
at Harvard,
Well-
he was a transfer, so they put him in Dunster House women's bathroom.
That's true.
Tell about that.
They had a housing shortage the year I transferred, and I came in as a junior. And so those of us who had transferred were put in temporary housing in Dunster House. Is it Dunster? It doesn't sound
Was
exactly
it,
right.
okay,
But
maybe
anyway,
not.
one of
I'm
the
not a
old
famous
traditional
person.
big houses right down on the Charles River, they had huge social events, and so they had a women's restroom that was 4 times as big as this, and they had put cots and a hat rack and a bedside table. And that's, so I loved it because my return address for the first month was women's restroom, Dunster. That's the most fun I had of the whole time.
But then they transferred him into Adams House, was the
You would have
big
loved
arts.
this. You know, Adams House,
I know.
it is
Oh,
the,
you
it
should.
is the drama and arts house.
Ah,
I didn't
okay.
know that. Again, I had no orientation to this. But, oh God, who's Fourth Rock from the Sun? John Lithgow.
Yes.
Was an Adams.
Was it
Drama.
that?
Well, and a
graduate,
lot of
yeah.
people, it will mention in write-ups on art and actors and musicians and stuff. There's several, I've seen lived in Adams
Lived
House.
in that place.
Mhm.
How did you get to Lubbock? And do you have your own firm, or are you with a group of other doctors, or?
No, I'm actually with the university, Texas Tech
Right.
University.
I knew that you had you were also a
Technical.
professor there.
It was a new medical school when we went.
Yeah, I was
It was-
one of the first people hired. Med schools start with the 2 years that are pretty much basic science stuff, and then the second 2 years are what we call clinical, when people
Right.
start making rounds in the ward and be associated with the hospital. So they already had the first 2 years underway, but I was in the group that came when they were just getting ready to start the clinical years. And I was one of the first people hired. The chairman of surgery, Dr. Baker, was one of the other ones. He called me Dr. Sound, and I called him Dr. Knife the whole time.
Because he was a surgeon. And he had roots back, he married a girl whose father was at Wake Forest Medical School. And wasn't he from Charleston or somewhere like that?
Who were we talking
Baker.
about? Oh, no, well, he was from
He
South
had-
Carolina.
He had
His-
Eastern.
His middle name was Furman, named for his mother's family. Those Furman.
Those firms.
Yeah, so he was, I have another story I'll tell you after.
All right. Tell me about the children, how old they are now and where they are.
Well,
Well, I
I
know,
guess we start with
but
that. Well, I guess David is the oldest, and he was born in '76, and we moved to Lubbock for the hospital opening that was supposed to be in, I guess, '77. He was 10 months old when we moved to Lubbock,
David,
and David was.
you're pointing.
Yeah, David was. And, David is David Elam Blackwell.
So her last name is his,
Yes.
a good southern
Good
tradition.
southern tradition.
And he's in Thailand right now. He says it's paradise. He's on an island in the Gulf of Thailand, and he's been there 4 years. I think he teaches martial arts, he does massages, and he says he loves the people there. He's part of a community that has a yoga university there, a Gama school, I think is there. There are a lot of expats that come and go. He has Swedish friends that have passports for 6 months and then 6 months in Sweden. So evidently some countries do that. But anyway, and Jonathan went to Duke and stayed around for a while, and then decided to do an MBA and got talked into going to Australia. You know, why don't you apply there? Because he had a girlfriend that wanted to go back and become a dual citizen. She'd lived there for 5 years, so he applied there and got in the #1 school in the Pacific Rim. And so
Nearly killed him. He did.
yeah, he got his degree because she decided to go back to the States, and she never got her dual citizenship. He has a wonderful Australian bride that they've been married 3 years.
A jewel.
She has her own design company, and he got a job right out of MBA with Ensemble Partners, which was a small consulting firm, and he said, my first customer has a kangaroo on its tail. It's Qantas Airlines was his first customer, and they had worked with Cadbury and their
Billington, the mining company.
yeah, he did a lot of seminars with. They decided that okay, they could reconstruct these businesses, and reorganize them to make be more efficient, but it's more successful if you tell everybody what you're doing and what their new role is. So then they started going, and he went to Tasmania several times and did workshops, and South Africa and did a workshop because they paired him with a CFO, which was a Frenchman that spelled like foray, but they're calling
Francois Foire. But he's the same spelling as the composer, Gabriel.
But he got an offer to come back to Lubbock to do marketing for the museum. It was out of the chancellor's office. They hired 2 people, and so he came back. But then the new director decided he would just do his own marketing. So I think he was hungry after the salary. So at any rate, but he's still there. He's going to start Rawls Business College and get a PhD. Because he thinks that will make him more global, and then he can go to different countries for different semesters.
I hope he's finding things to do because we're so happy to have you in Lubbock.
Yeah,
It's a long way to
house
Sydney.
sitting and
Although
cat
it's
sitting
beautiful.
and picking us up at the airport.
And then Elizabeth, who you just met,
Yes.
has an interesting career of her own. She finished with an MBA from Washington, from American University in Washington, in international service, and then went to India and worked for a year. Her job was sort of liaison between these women weavers in the little primitive community and Barney's in New York. So it was like bridging the gap between
Well, it's
these
Mayet.
two
It's a
extremes.
clothing company called MAIYET, and you can go online and like their site and see their fashion
It has
shows.
something to do with Mayet things like feather, like the Egyptian thing where you weigh your heart against the feather to see where you go in the afterlife, and your heart better not be heavier. Anyway, so it's a good organization. So she was over there for more than a year, and Janis and Jonathan and his wife to be actually proposed to her at the Taj Mahal.
Yeah, we went over her last month. I spent with her there, and he went over for a week and brought Angela, who was into fabrics and design and stuff like that. But she went to these SEWAs, and that stood for Self-Employed Women's Associations, SEWA. And so she was a go-between from this high-end clothing line that wanted to design their own things rather than using the set designs. And they would decide which ones could do the embroidery, and they would send them out.
But these women were doing still hand embroidery with gold thread and things like that apparently you really cannot do by machine, at least yet. And yeah. Anyway, she ended up then with a baby, thank goodness.
Yes, well,
Jake.
she and Rich have been together. They've been together for over 10 years, and he wanted to go to Guatemala and start a hub. And so when Jake was less than a year old, they moved to Guatemala, and Antigua, Guatemala, and started the hub. And it's going pretty well, and then he started a fund, an impact fund. And
The hub is sort of to get businesses established, and the orientation is that they should have a socially meaningful purpose. You know, it's not just any business, but the ones that are going to be community oriented.
well, and Antiqua's a place where a lot of people come through and they stay for a while and they do business at their places, but since you can do so many things in your laptop, they often have to have a place to fax and to have conferences and to stuff, and so this facility, it's a beautiful facility.
And she's now back in Washington, D.C.
Because that's where they were, in a condo,
And the
it
educational opportunities
vacated.
are better for Jay. She was not happy with what was available in
And so
How old
he
is
just,
he?
He's about to be 4.
uh-huh.
Really?
His birthday is 9/11, so we have a good reason
Oh,
to
wow.
celebrate.
A good reason to celebrate.
Yeah,
Yes.
Well, he's just a little jewel.
Yeah, he is. He's a beautiful child, so.
You're not prejudiced.
No.
are you?
Yeah.
Aren't you glad that we have the internet so that all these people, far-flung places, you don't have to worry about stamps and whatever, you can just send an email to everywhere that you have children.
Well, I recently found a shoebox full of letters. You remember the lightweight blue Avion letters?
I
You know,
do.
that you- Well, Bob Vance, the group, when he was in Africa, he and I apparently had a good
Yeah.
correspondence going on these, and I kept all of his. And I recently sent them to his daughter so
Oh, I'm
that
sure
she
she
could
enjoyed them.
make use of them in whatever way she sees fit.
Well, and
One of
his-
them, Bob had a good sense of humor. It said on the back in large letters, "To open, insert big toe and twist."
But his mother, their family, the Browns, have all of the letters that,
This is back to my family.
the Browns, his mother's family, they have all the letters, they say the ones that the man who died on the Sultana wrote. And the very last letter that was sent back that she wrote. And you've sent them to.
I scanned them and made them available on the internet, and several people have used them in teaching because this guy was just a private. He was older, but so it's the war's view from kind of a different perspective, not the things you expect from the officers on the review boards or whatever. And he was pretty literate. I really wondered if they had a template, because his letters start out with these very formal things like, "My dearest so-and-so, I seat myself this evening to write these few lines." And I thought, well, wow. And then I found a lot of other Civil War letters starting exactly. It's like maybe they gave him a template and said, you need to write home, maybe you should use
You
this.
should have been-
Because that's pretty fancy. Like
I've been
But
grateful.
they're very interesting, and I don't know if Carson Newman has them or how you get to them.
No,
but-
the originals are now with East Carolina, I believe, East Tennessee, in their archives in Johnson City.
But several people have used them.
I've always suspected that your mother descended from John Brown, who wrote Old Pioneers.
Well, there
I'd
are
like to
so
think
many
so.
John Browns in his family.
Really?
Yeah, if you
Oh,
go,
yeah.
we used to go up to the Mormon library,
In
because
Salt
they
Lake
have
City.
so many.
Latter-day.
I've
Yeah.
always been interested in that because I'm named for the Samses. And the Reverend Leroy Sams married A.C. Brown from the Red Banks of Chucky, which is Irvin and the same family.
That's
that
right,
we-
Chucky.
Yeah,
My
yeah,
dad had a
yes,
farm in
exactly.
Chucky.
Yes, I know.
Yeah,
Yes.
we need to
But
pursue
anyway,
that.
yeah, I think that distantly we're related. That's why I wanted to share with you the Hands of Heritage.
Well,
Well, my brother, when he
you
was
have
with
hard hands
NCR
to
and he
fill
was
in
going,
that realm, I'm afraid.
yeah, and he was going overseas with NCR, we laughed because he used Chucky, Tennessee
Yes.
as his address. And
Well, he could have used women's restroom.
but we laughed and said his post office box has a toothbrush maybe in there. I don't know.
Irvin was the Red Banks of Chucky.
Yes.
Before we wind up, I would like to ask you both, what do you think, based on your knowledge of him and your mom and mother-in-law, what was Dr. Blackwell's greatest legacy here?
Wait,
To see if it's anyone in dire need. Okay, that's wrong.
you want to turn out?
It'll stop in a second. I think community almost before college. I mean, they were so intertwined into everything, and it was so important to them. I mean, the fact that my mother could live in the house that she lived in until the week she died was because if she didn't show up at prayer meetings, 7 people would come up to see if she was all right. I mean, so she had that level of supervision from the community.
Well,
and then they loved the community in return. You know, I mean, Mother loved what she did here, teaching the Sunday school class, running the clothes closet, whatever it was. And I had very good friends. Mrs. Elam and Olive, despite their age differences, were very good friends.
And my dad used to call Dad Blackwell his holy man.
Yes.
He'd go over
You
and
can
talk
hear
to
his
him.
voice. I go visit my holy man.
That Morrisville community affected all of the students on the campus profoundly. Woodrow Edwards had a hauling business, and he would take his truck all the way to California, and he would run into an alum, and first people they would ask about would be community people, not faculty or
Yes,
staff.
well, that fits with my recollection of things. Is
So
that
community,
this was,
and Dr. Blackwell helped to bring that.
there was a lot of cross-pollination.
Well, I wanted to say about Dr. Blackwell, he was just an honest man. Somebody said, you know, how did he get all this money when he'd go around with Dean Lee, who got a terrible cold because he didn't have a heater in his car. Until they would go around, you know, bare bones budget, you know.
Yeah.
And he was honest. I mean, people could trust him. So they knew that he would take good care of their money.
Right.
And he would be honest in what he said he would do.
I went into his office one time when I was a student during his last 10 years, and Miss Francis wouldn't let me go in. So he would have periods of depression. I don't know whether you know that or not, where he would worry about a lot of things, whether it be the forest catching on fire in South Carolina or
Yeah.
whatever. And so I had to see him that day. So Miss Francis said, the president's not seeing students. I raised my voice and said, but I need to see Daddy Blackwell today. He heard my voice, opened the door, Richard, come here. I go in and he had been crying. There were tears on his cheek. And I said, Dr. Blackwell, what on earth is wrong? He said, Richard, I'm worrying about things that I shouldn't, but anyway, I'll tell you. He said, God called me to be a professor. And he says, I ended up being an administrator, and I've spent my whole life raising money, and I've missed my calling. And I said, but Dr. Blackwell, God has sent me today here to tell you that he changed your profession. And you've done very well. I said, now you cannot
I bet that
have...
honestly helped him.
No, it did. Let me tell you what happened. I said, you can't have teaching without professors and desks and chalkboards and electricity and heat. And you made all that possible. Now you're going to retire, and you can go back to that classroom if you want to. And
Well,
he began smiling, and dawned on him that was the truth. So God sent me to tell him
Well,
that.
thank you for
Well, no.
sharing that.
But
story.
my problem was in there, I had to graduate and needed $20, and the bazaar wouldn't lend it to me. So Dr. Blackwell pulls out his checkbook and writes a check for $20 and says, Richard, you're graduating your class Sunday morning at the Baptist Church. And he got me my degree.
Oh my goodness.
I love that.
Yeah.
Just one last thing that about Dad that I only found out, of course, later is every place he went as a student, he was offered a position to stay on. He was quite serious about it. And he said when he was first learning Greek that he pasted up, you know, Greek things all around his dorm room so that he couldn't look anywhere without seeing something that would then reinforce, you know. And he had a chance to come to Texas, actually.
To Hardin Center.
Hardin Center, yeah. And turned them down. And then the story is, and I think it's in the McLeod book, that they wrote back and said, well, the fact that you would turn us down for this little school means that you have character to a depth we can't imagine. We're offering you even better offers. He still turned it down.
Wasn't he offered a Baylor job also?
I don't know about Baylor. But not just those jobs, he was offered a job with Coca-Cola. Do you know this? I think when he was at Mars Hill, he must have worked on the Coke loading platform in Asheville. And he was so reliable, you know, at everything he did, and so just, you know, no trouble, that he was offered a position that would have put him on the corporate ladder in the Coca-Cola company, so we could have.
But he just had an aura about him that we had an assistant priest come to Lubbock, and they said of her, if you had a problem and you walked into the room and you just had to tell somebody your problem, you would have gone to her. And I think he had that same kind of aura that people trusted him, people loved him, and they knew he was there for them.
The Lunsford administration envisioned seeing a return of what Dr. Blackwell gave to the school and the community in building the day building. They designed that in a specific way so that in the future it would help to retie the town and the community to the campus. And now they going to have a master's degree in business facilitating
Well,
that
so
tie back.
glad
And the whole day building is that extended vision of Dr. Blackwell, in my opinion.
Well, again, having traversed the whole bell-shaped
Yes.
curve of,
Yes.
growing up here, being away forever, and now
Yes.
being old enough to hopefully have some time to look into some of these things I've always wondered about. And the first place I'm gonna start is your archive.
Yeah.
It's been
Well,
just-
and I'm so glad they're keeping that building too.
Yes, yes.
Because that's a sense of community. You have to look after your community because you know, it's important.
Thank you, both of you, for taking time to do this. And John and Richard, it's always a pleasure.
So I pontificated, I should not have it.
Oh,
No,
Not at all.
no, it was great.
You
thank you,
pontificate.
really.
Oh,
Well, maybe you did. I don't know.
yeah.
In an essay entitled An Apology for Idlers, Robert Louis Stevenson wrote, "There is no duty we so much underrate as the duty of being happy. By being happy, we sow anonymous benefits upon the world which remain unknown even to ourselves, or when they are disclosed, surprise nobody so much as the benefactor. The other day," said Mr. Stevenson, "a ragged, barefoot boy ran down the street after a marble with so jolly an air that he set everyone he passed into a good humor. A happy person is indeed a radiating focus of goodwill. The writer of the book of Proverbs tells us that a merry heart doeth good like a medicine. Happiness is elusive. It is difficult to define. We know when we are happy, and we know when we are not happy. We know that happiness is a universal desire of the human heart. We know that other people can help to make us happy. We know that others can impair our happiness. We know also that it grows up from within ourselves. Define it, we cannot. The formula for happiness is not always the same, but there are certain ingredients that must go into its making. First of all is the ingredient of faith. Faith in God and faith in man. A faith in God so deeply rooted as to cause one to be loyal to Him in one's manner of life. Moreover, a faith that is so vital and dynamic as to constrain one to support the enterprises of the kingdom of God everywhere in the world, beginning at home. Then there is work, honorable, necessary, purposeful work. Someone has said whether you handle a pick or a pen, a wheelbarrow or a set of books, dig ditches or edit a paper, ring an auction bell or write funny things, you must work. And love also is an ingredient of happiness. And now abideth faith, hope, love. God is love. Remember always that millions of people all over the world are actually starving and dying from a lack of love suffering, vicarious love. Last of all, for now, comes peace of mind. A peace of mind which results from the consciousness that one is practicing the virtues set forth by the prophet Micah in these words. He hath showed thee, O man, what is good, and what doth the Lord require of thee, but to do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with thy God. We have had 2 happy, very happy years together. In the name and in the spirit of Alma Mater, I bid you Godspeed as you go out to fulfill your duty of being happy, and in so doing to make a sad world glad, and to make the human family better and happier.
Preview.